Sometimes working with male animals can be challenging. Well, right now we are in basically the middle of our Icelandic sheep breeding season. The Icelandic sheep are more or less a seasonal breed. They do come into heat a little faster when there's a ram around, but they're basically a fall breeding sheep, which has its advantages, but it also has some disadvantages. We wanted to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about sort of, I guess, one of the many reasons why we keep so many male animals, A, but B, why it's also problematic and why sometimes you have to really think about it before you just plunge ahead. So this here is Rasta. And you've seen him before as he comes over. You've seen him before as he's one of our rams who roos quite easily. And of course we are in the breeding season. So as I kind of zoom back from him, you can see he's got two girls that we've decided to put him with this year. And unfortunately for him today, neither of them is in heat, and that's causing a little bit of a dilemma. So I suppose the plus side of keeping multiple male animals is because we have a bit of a prepper mindset. I will say it that way. And it comes from experience, because the one thing we will say is if you only have one male, for example, and you get to breeding season and you can't find another one, that can be problematic. And some people would say, well, I'll just cross for that season, etc. But the more unique the qualities the animal gives you, the harder that is to do, to be quite blunt. So the plus side to having multiple males is we kind of use this rule of 4, and we try our best to always breed from sort of 4 different males so that we can rotate a little bit. In the case of sheep, it doesn't mean we wouldn't add a ram in the future. In fact, last year we actually added 2, one of which was Rasta. But that plus of having the genetic ability to weather a few years without having to, or without being dependent on getting something and sourcing a new animal from somebody, does come at a bit of a price. The obvious negative is you've got to manage multiple males. And having had goats and sheep, when it comes to sheep, the rams are hard on each other. There's really no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Now, as I said, we are in the middle of breeding season. And what we're starting to notice, and why I've mentioned Rasta, is because we started to notice some bad behavior. Now, before I get into that, I will say any male animal that has sort of a seasonal cycle, so roosters have a seasonal cycle, geese have a seasonal cycle, goats in some breeds have seasonal cycles, and so do sheep. You expect more aggression, testosterone, all of those sort of things at those times. So I don't want people to think that what we're talking about here is sort of normal ram behavior, although some of it still is. What I'm talking about here is Rasta's so he's now 4. And one thing that we were actually talking about recently in one of our lives was when it comes to big livestock, you could keep him for a very long time, but are you going to want to? And why I say that is as they get older, a ram or a bull or a buck that maybe was really good as a young animal could start to develop some tendencies that make him harder to manage. In the case of our rams, a battering ram is a real thing. Our rams all have horns, which is a whole nother discussion that we might come back to in a future video. But when they start to learn to use those horns, and they start to learn to use those horns against doors and gates and infrastructure and those sort of things, it becomes problematic. Another thing we've noticed, and this is what we bring up about the breeding season, as we mentioned, the 2 ewes that he's with today aren't in heat. And even though he didn't put on a show for you out here, what spurred this whole video on is he started to use his horns on the ladies as well. And so while we are going to use them for this season, we expect, and we've seen it before with other rams, that those behaviors will continue. And until he gets really old, there will be a point when he's in sort of his peak physical prowess, for lack of a better way to put it, that he's really going to learn that he can throw his weight around. And that's why we say on a homestead scale, when you're not trying to cover vast numbers of ewes or cows or does or whatever it is, do you necessarily want to have a lot of large adult males around? When you're working in a commercial scale, a big ram, a big mature ram, a big mature bull, they can cover a lot of cows, they can cover a lot of ewes. But we're trying to do the opposite. We're keeping our flock small enough but diverse enough that we can keep it going and mix and match within our ewe lines and what have you, that we never have big breeding groups. And so when you're doing it on a small scale, those big, nice, mature males can be problematic, and that's definitely something to think about. So some of you know from who followed us for a while, our solution to this problem is to use younger ram lambs. There's issues with that too, which we can go into in a different video because it's a little different. But what we basically have found, the Icelandic sheep are plenty old enough to do the job within their first year. It allows you to constantly bump animals, which at face value doesn't make sense because male animals are expensive. To go and replace an Icelandic ram, on the cheap end, you might be looking at $350 up to like $700. So big price difference there, big difference in quality, and hassle trying to sort that because a lot of the times they're also not close to you. But by using the younger ones, if you bump them, i.e. you use them for breeding and most of them go on to fill your freezer afterwards, you've gotten an extra product out of them, but you've also moved around some genetics. And so one thing we try to do, although the last 2 years we have had more than one big mature ram, is we really try to only keep one, because you can manage one, but when you start on a small scale, when you start having multiples, it gets difficult. But the last 2 years we've had 2. So this year we have 2 who are unrelated, and last year we had 2 that were unrelated that we actually bought as a pair. And what's interesting about that is we think some of the negative attributes or behaviors that are coming out of Rasta now are potentially because of his dynamics with his former flock mate, who's no longer with us, who was definitely the dominant ram. Essentially, if it was a relationship, Rasta would have been the beaten down portion of that relationship. But now he's in amazing shape. He's bounced back really, really well. And that's another part. Sometimes when you get a big mature male who's in great shape like that, and they're feeling good, they, like we said, can really throw their weight around. So of course, the one downside to this video is when you're kind of just filming what you're doing, sometimes it's really hard to capture the here and the in the moment part of it, i.e. we filmed them a couple of times and they're very uneventful. And so at face value, this video, what I'm saying and what I'm showing don't necessarily line up. But the one thing I can tell you when it comes to livestock, when things go bad, it tends to happen really quickly. And I think that's really the point of this video, because I know there are lots of sheep breeders and lots of people who raise livestock on bigger scales than we do. They manage lots of big male animals.
Even though it does pay to hang on to those good behaving rams, or as Chris was saying, geese, that sort of thing, it still also pays to be prepared for the moment that they do turn, because you have to always be thinking it might happen and you need to have a backup plan. And that's where, as we were saying, if we only had the one ram, you're stuck that you have to keep that ram no matter how violent he becomes. And we do have, Rasta has not become violent in that nature. I mean, we've had a ram, was that 2 years ago with Double? Mm-hmm. 2 years ago, a ram lamb. So only a ram lamb. And he destroyed 2 stalls in our barn, busted doors, knocked down pillars, support pillars. Like, he just rammed until he bled. It didn't matter. He wanted out. He wanted to be with the girls. And a decision had to be made very quick. And if we hadn't had other rams and that was all we had, I don't know what we would have done. I guess you'd still have gotten rid of them and hoped you could buy another one, but you never know if you're going to be able to. So that is the mindset sometimes of you've got to have extra just in case you can't use the one you've got.
One other thing I should mention, because I'm sounding a little bit negative, but not all male animals are created equal. And the second large ram we have, who I'm not going to film because the lighting in here is not great, he's in the barn today, he's the exact opposite this year. And I think that's one of those things. We did a video, was it last winter or maybe the winter before, about our geese and how a lot of people think of geese as these big, nasty, mean birds, and that's why they won't have them. But we have a male who is the friendliest, most personable goose, that even when he has babies and everything else, he's not aggressive towards people. And I think that's one of those things that comes into play too, that when you get male animals that are that way, those ones make sense to hold on to as long as you can, until you either don't have animals to breed them to, or you start to notice the negative behaviors. Because in all our years keeping Icelandic sheep, we've had one other ram who never developed any sort of bad habits, for lack of a better way to put it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to keep him long term because of his horns. But I did want to just mention that, because it's not all negative. It's just you're going to have to watch your animals and read the signs and learn how to read the signs to be able to make those choices when you need to make them. So even though, as he walks away from me here, he's been a good ram up until this point, you are going to always get to that point, if you're raising livestock, where you basically have to make a choice or a decision of do you keep them longer, i.e. the male equation, or part of the equation, or do you decide to part ways and move on to the next generation?